Hi there. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our next week of Jewish Women of the Holocaust. I'm sorry I haven't had a video up for a few weeks. I was traveling, but I am keeping up with your assignments and reading. I know I'm a little bit behind on grading, but I should have grading done pretty soon for everything, but I've been reading everything that people have been bringing in. And just a few things for this week. In addition to your reading for this week of Jewish Women of the Holocaust, which I'm going to be talking about with you today, Women of the Holocaust. I also am including a survivor testimony. The Shoah Foundation was started by Steven Spielberg. You can research more about it. I'll put a link in the description. He realized in the 90s that Holocaust survivors were dying, and that if we didn't get their testimonies on video, then we may not have witnesses to the atrocities that you all have been spending weeks and weeks reading about. So actually, my husband had a job as being a testimony taker for the Shoah Foundation. So what did the Shoah Foundation do? They would go to Holocaust survivors all over the world, not just in the United States. My husband worked out of the California office. And interestingly enough, because people who were at that time, this is in the 90s when they started, who were still alive, were dying. They were getting into their elderly years and were dying at a pretty quick rate. They actually had transcribers and interviewers working 24/7 to try to collect as many testimonies as possible. So there's a lot of them on the internet for you to watch. I'm going to link one today for you to watch so you can see one person's personal testimony. I know we've been reading a lot about it, but I think it's different to actually see someone's actual testimony. And I think it'll be good for us as we go through the women. I think for the next few weeks, I'm going to be linking different testimonies for you to look at every week. And I think especially as we dive into the Women of the Holocaust in the Holocaust book, interestingly enough, I first used this book when I was in college. When I did a book, it wasn't a book on women of the Holocaust, but it was a book about it was called Jewish Women, International Perspective or something like that. It kind of was a general Jewish women's studies book. This book came out in 1998, so it would have been pretty new. I think I read it in like 1999. And it's interesting because this is probably more of the most academic of the books that we're going to be reading. I know some people wrote in their reflections and in the discussion board about the repetition piece of it. And look, certainly the Marion Kaplan piece in part one is going to be something that you've read already. So I hope you sort of skimmed by that. Last week we had part one and part two, and then part two. And actually, no, last week was the introduction and part one. And then this week it's part two and part three. An interesting point about part two is there is a testimony about the Grodno ghetto and its underground, a personal narrative. And that is actually where my family is from. So that's something personal for me to look at, that my family came over. The family that I have from Grodno came over in like 1915. So they came over before the Holocaust, but it's definitely personal to me to read all about that. But really what this book sets you up to understand is how gender plays out, not only in the Holocaust, but in our study of the Holocaust. So sometimes for those of you who are in humanities, there's something called, there's not just history, but there's also the study of history. How do we tell our stories? And actually there's this really great, this has nothing to do with the Holocaust, but there's this really great documentary now from the BBC that's called History's Biggest Fibs. And it's by Dr. Lucy Worsley, who is a British historian. And she goes through different pieces of British history. And she talks about how things are passed down in history, but then what is that the real, why was it passed down that way, and what's the actual story? And I think even though the Holocaust happened so recently, we can also do that with Holocaust history, is look at how are the stories being told. I mean, I know that when I was a kid and I was in high school, or I was just a Jewish person growing up, the women's piece of it, or the gender, I should say, the gender piece of Holocaust history was not spoken about. There was nothing distinguishing about the female experience. And when I read this book for the first time in college, it was the first time that I actually even realized that I should be looking at the Holocaust through the lens of gender. I'm thinking specifically of chapter 3, the missing 52% research on Jewish women in interwar Poland and its implication for Holocaust studies. So if we don't understand the roles of Jewish women in interwar Poland, how can we understand why they did or didn't revolt? How can, like, there's so many, if you don't know what you're talking about and you don't go in depth into what a woman's role would have been different. It's something in history that they forget about a lot. A woman's role would have been different for various reasons. So, you know, chapter 5 definitely is I think actually chapter 4 you would find really interesting, sort of about the different Jewish labor movements. A lot of them turn into the Zionist movements. Chapter 5, ordinary women in like Nazi Germany. We definitely talked about that in the last book, talking about women who were either bystanders or perpetrators and things like that. Then coming in this week into part 2, we have the Grodno Ghetto. We have part 2 focusing on life in the ghettos, which I think is unique and interesting. We read a little bit about it already, but this specifically focuses on women's and gender issues in the ghetto. So it's more of an academic. It does start out with a personal story, but it goes into the gender piece. And that's what I want you to focus on in your discussion this week is how does gender play out in the ghetto? And then in part 3 with resistance and rescue, we have already read some things about this. So, you know, what I've been trying to do in this class is really to give you a foundation. I know that most people are coming with a very limited Holocaust history background, and I'm trying to give you a foundation for it. I think you definitely have one now after the first few books that we read, especially those of you who are keeping up with everything. And I can tell from your different responses how people are keeping up with things. But this is more like understanding exactly how women resisted in the ghetto, how gender played out in that. Passing, there's a very interesting chapter on chapter 11 about what it meant to pass. There is, you know, oftentimes there's sort of people talk about that if you were Jewish but you had Aryan features, you could pretend not to be Jewish. And you could pass on the non-Jewish side, which obviously was scary. You would get, you know, like false papers, and there's talk about people dyeing their hair and stuff like that. But you certainly have plenty of Jewish people today. People live in El Paso who have blonde hair and blue eyes. So that whole eugenics piece, you know, that we read about earlier about Hitler and trying to find genetic traits for Jewish or non-Aryan people doesn't always work. So I think that's an interesting piece to talk about what it meant to be passing while you watch everyone else of your culture and ethnicity being persecuted. Women of the forest partisans, that's very interesting. Women in the French Jewish underground, and then another personal account to try to make the stories as personal as possible. So next week, I am going to give you a video that shows the actual going into the different actual concentration camps. We're not going to do that this week because that more goes into next week. But it's very interesting. I mean, this book it's one of the first ones I think that came out that really looked at the gender piece and how things were more. I know that for myself, I didn't think about what it meant to get pregnant in the concentration camps or have a period in the concentration camps, or the sexual abuse of women that took place in the concentration camps, or how a woman might be saved if she was a girlfriend of an SS officer. I'm using that term loosely, of an SS officer. These are all things that were certainly not talked about when I was doing general Holocaust history education. And this is the first book that I ever saw that really brought a lot of those issues to the forefront. So I know some of you are saying that some of it is repetitive, but I think it's interesting to look at it from a gender studies perspective. And what does this book bring that other books don't bring as we continue on this journey together? And you do have your denial paper due pretty soon. I'm going to look up right now. I know it's coming up. You have a midterm. Study for midterm. So your midterm is going to open up on March 24th. So we got a little while for that. That's just something to think about. And so the midterm is going to pull together a lot of these themes that we have. And then your denial paper, oh, it's not due until the end. It's May 1st. But if you want to watch it at some point before then. So really, and like the next book, but when biology becomes destiny, is going to focus even more on the gender piece. So as you can see, I'm sort of, the plan here was to give you sort of a basis in the Holocaust, to spend some time talking about the Nazi women, which wasn't originally in the curriculum for this, but I think is really important. And now we're focusing on sort of the gender studies side of this. And again, your midterm is probably going to be a lot of essays, and there aren't going to be a lot of right answers. It's going to be a lot of reflection on all these different books we've read, on partisans, on Nazi women, on life in Germany before 1938, things like that. So thank you so much for being on this journey with me, and let me know if you have any questions. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.